Uh, okay, so first of all, yeah, let me say a big welcome. Thank you for coming along. Obviously, a special thanks to Professor Nivedita Menon for making the time to be with us from Delhi. And of course, our thoughts are with everybody in Delhi and India at the moment. First of all, I just want to say this conversation has been organised as part of the New Social Imaginaries project. And so I just want to acknowledge the rest of my team, Kaushalya Aryaratna, who many of you probably had dealings with on the other side of the New Social Imaginaries email, Hasana Segui Zadin and Eva Ambos. So the four of us are all, and I'm Kieran Greywell. Sorry, I didn't actually introduce myself. I'm Kieran Greywell. So the four of us are all part of a project known as the New Social Imaginaries Project. And we are currently in the process of running a decolonial summer school program. The second one that we've tried. The first one was in 2019 in Sri Lanka. This is our first experiment online. So I also want to welcome all of our summer school participants who are hopefully here with us tonight as well. I also want to acknowledge that this is organised also through the Unit for Global Justice at Goldsmiths, and to thank my co-director, Kirsten Campbell, who's also here for supporting this. Also, I wanted to just give a little plug that there'll be another conversation like this happening in a couple of weeks' time with Professor Linda Martin Alcoff, who will also be speaking about the Decolonial Project, focusing a little bit more on questions of epistemology, race and resistance. So please join us again if you can. And I just wanted to also say a little something before I introduce Professor Menon, that actually originally we had invited Nivedita to join us for a workshop that was happening in Colombo in January 2020. And little did we know just how disrupted life would get after that. Unfortunately, at that time, Nivedita couldn't join us because of the very difficult situation she and many others were facing at that time in Delhi with everything that was happening around her university, JNU. And it was very sad that we didn't have her at that workshop, but probably the saddest part of that is that one of the other people who has been really instrumental, both for me personally in terms of an inspiring feminist intellectual, but someone who's been very instrumental in our project, who's also a close friend of Nivedita Menon, Dr. Malati de Alwis, had passed away last year. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that actually she's deeply missed, and we would have loved to have had her here for this conversation. So just, to pay credit to an incredible feminist scholar, intellectual, and activist. So the running order for today will be that Nivedita and I are going to be in conversation for about 45 minutes. I've basically got a list of just a few of the burning questions that I've been dying to ask her and hear her thoughts on. And then we will open up for a broader Q&A. So as I've said, we're recording the first part of this session. And as I've also already said, keep your questions, post them in the chat if you feel like it. Otherwise, save them up. And I hope that there'll be plenty of time for us to have a proper conversation. So I think that's all by way of introduction. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Menon to join us this evening. So apart from being one of my heroes and a great inspiration to me personally, she's also a professor at the Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. She's the author of a number of very important books, I think, including Seeing Like a Feminist, most recently, but also Recovering Subversion, Feminist Politics Beyond the Law, Power and Contestation, India After 1989, and a number of other edited volumes, including Gender and Politics in India, Sexualities, and Critical Studies in Politics, Exploring Sites, Selves, Power. She's also a regular commentator on the blog Kafila, which we'll also speak about a little bit later, and is active in democratic politics in India. She's also, alongside all of that, managed to find time to translate fiction and non-fiction from Hindi and Malayalam into English, and also from Malayalam into Hindi, and won awards for it as well. So she's clearly a woman of many talents. So welcome, and thank you again for being here with us. So maybe just to start, we've called the event Decolonial Feminisms. And so I wanted to ask you what the Decolonial project means to you, and how you think about this term decolonial feminisms. What is it different to, the sort of third world feminisms proposed by people like Kumari Jayawardena? Is it different to post-colonial feminisms that have developed over the number of decades, subaltern feminisms? How do you think about the relationship between these, and what does the decolonial part involve for you? Nivedita, you're on mute.
Yes, sometimes one forgets to mute and sometimes one forgets to unmute. Okay, so I was sorry, I was thanking you, Kiran, for giving me the opportunity to meet all of you and to have this conversation. And I thank you especially for honoring Malati Alves at the beginning of this conversation. I do remember her every moment, and she is a remarkable feminist scholar who was at beginning the peak of her work, and it's an irreparable loss. So I thank you for honoring her memory. So it's the term decolonial, certainly among all the terms that you mentioned, third world, post-colonial, subaltern, etc. I think I relate most closely to decolonial, the term decolonial. And very much influenced for me directly from Walter Mignolo, and to the extent that Medina Klotsnova has also worked on it. So it's very directly from there that I draw my connection to the term. I don't think I have used the term in my own work, in the sense of I haven't actually written decolonial in any part of my work yet, but when I read Mignolo and when I understand the term, it's very evident that the project is decolonial. So, to refer to Mignolo, as many of you and perhaps most of you are aware, he does not want to set up a competition between post-colonial and decolonial. And as you know, he prefers to use the term options rather than alternatives. That there are multiple options, and depending on the context, you could draw on any one of these. Nevertheless, I find decolonial and captures the project of feminism in the Global South. And I'd like to say a little bit more about how I use the term Global South, but I think it captures the project of feminism better than. So I am choosing between post-colonial and decolonial because coloniality is the term that Mignolo uses to describe the push towards what he calls the Western code, right? Which is the one universal body or form of knowledge, whether theologically inflected or inflected through secular philosophy, through science. So the rejection of this Western code and the recognition of multiple futures and multiple locations and multiple histories. The Western code, of course, for him begins from 1492. So that's another distinction between post-colonial as a conceptual term and decolonial as a conceptual term, because post-colonial generally refers to the colonialism of Asia, Africa, 19th, 20th century. So this takes it further back. So I do find the term decolonial extremely useful. I find it sets up the possibility of multiple ways of engaging with this kind of universal Western code, and it opens up multiplicities, it opens up histories, it opens up the present in different ways. So yes, I do find the term decolonial quite useful. Now, of course, you talked about, you mentioned Kumari Jayawardena. I think the idea of third world feminisms does have a huge purchase. But perhaps I could use this moment to just say how I think a shift has been made to the notion of the global south, um, which too is, of course, not a geographical or a spatial category. It's a conceptual term. Global south is an attempt to capture the ways in which imperialism and multiple experiences of marginalization and discrimination have worked. And there is what some scholars have called a trans-hemispheric element to it, in the sense that there is a global south and the global north. In the sense, so indigenous peoples, Black people in the USA, and so on, right? So the global south is a conceptual term that captures this experience. And between decoloniality and the global south, we get one more gain, which is the refusal to treat the global south or the space where coloniality operates as homogeneous. So in other words, I suspect, or I sense, that post-colonialism tends to set up empire as the other. This is not true for every scholar who uses the term. So I really don't want to actually set it up as a competition. But why I prefer the term decolonial or decoloniality and coloniality and so on is that it opens up the possibility of looking at heterogeneous ways in which these spaces are shot through with power. Caste, for example, is internal. It has nothing to do with empire. Caste is an internal mode of discrimination, and through the term coloniality and decoloniality.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And it also reassures me, because I realized that I had never actually seen the term used in your work, but I was still drawn to the idea that you were actually the person I wanted to speak to about this. So I'm glad that instinct was right. I suppose maybe one of the reasons why I suspected that you were drawn to this term is from the book Seeing Like a Feminist, when you have a whole chapter where you talk a lot about the body, and you bring in some very interesting scholars from different parts of the world, and we can talk more about that in a minute. But as you know, we're currently running a summer school on the theme of decolonizing the body. So I wondered if you could say something about what you see the place of the body to be within a decolonial project, and particularly within sort of decolonial feminisms. How do we approach the body maybe differently?
In many ways, I think feminisms have, in a sense, predated the emergence of the term decolonial. So if you look at the ways in which queer feminisms have emerged across the global south, so I'm only talking about the global south now, but of course globally, the emergence of queer feminisms has troubled the idea of the body quite substantially, drawing on different kinds of sources. So there's one kind of source which actually is available to us. So actually, this is something, again, Mignolo also points out, that there is a critique of modernity, European modernity, that emerges from within Europe. And there he talks about psychoanalysis and Marxism and so on, but he doesn't mention feminism, because Western feminism has in fact been posed a very strong challenge to the idea of the way science operates, modernity, and all of that. It's an internal critique. So what I mean is, even from the West and even from within modernity, this critique has emerged. So feminism has always been troubled by the body. So what additionally happens when we look at the global south in the way in which I'm speaking about it, the trans-hemispheric global south, is that we recognize the ways in which the body is constructed. We recognize, for example, that the trans body emerges as an aberration and as a pathology in Europe in the 15th, 16th centuries. And so in our parts of the world, that process is actually completed by colonialism, the process of othering the body that is neither that is not necessary. It's just the gender non-binary body, right? It had a space, it had a legitimacy. There were cultural kinds of rich cultural traditions around such bodies. So the idea that every body is entirely male and entirely female and so on is a gift of European Enlightenment and colonial modernity. And all kinds of queer feminisms have challenged this in multiple ways. So I think any decolonial project of feminism would only be tapping into multiple ways in which queer feminisms have problematize the body and address the ways in which bodies are sort of materialized in the particular ways in which they are materialized in these binary forms. So I think the body is a very, very crucial element, of course, for decolonial feminism to engage with.
Well, and I think you pick up something very important there about also the site of knowledge production and theory making, that, as you're saying, this is coming from particular movements, which is also, challenging the idea of who produces the knowledge. But also I'm thinking there about Maria Lugones's very important contribution to this idea of coloniality of power, to say that actually it's not just along the matrices of race and capital, but also this idea of the dimorphism, gender dimorphism, that we need this binary, that's also very much sort of central to the colonial project, and a very important part of addressing it, something that we need to address in the decolonial. So maybe that's sort of a good segue into the next question, which I wanted to ask you, which is, one of the things I've always admired about your work is how you are very attentive to the specificities of context. And obviously, you're very embedded in the Indian context, but also you are able to see and make connections with other locations, experiences, ideas. For example, in Seeing Like a Feminist, that particular chapter where you're talking about gender and body, you engage quite a lot with the Nigerian feminist scholar, Oyerunki Oyewumi. And it just reminded me that I was recently listening to a lecture by Achille Mbembe, where he was basically saying that for him, an important dimension of the colonial project is that it was a project of planetary control. And so as a result, for him, decolonization is not complete if we only remain within our particular locales. But what we need to do is find a way to actually speak across our differences, not through one master narrative, as you said, but find ways in which we can speak to each other about, shared experiences or commonalities. And so I wondered if you could say something more about how you approach that question of, the sort of grounded local that you're engaging with and the kind of the global that you're also engaging with.
I think that the term global South enables those kinds of conversations. And the idea of the decolonial and decoloniality and decolonizing, these are ideas that lie behind the conceptual term global South. And if we take the idea of the global South, as I expressed it, the trans-hemispheric global South, seriously, then we are actually assuming conversations between caste and race, for example. But at the same time, one is not saying caste is race or race is caste, but that there are, Isabel Wilkerson, of course, places in her, in her really interesting, and it's a very tendentious way that she poses it, and it has not been received equally well everywhere, theoretically. But I find it very interesting the way in which she thinks of caste as a kind of skeleton, right, on which ideas of even race and so on emerge. So there are arguments of that sort which kind of prioritize them, these categories on the same plane. But I see Isabel Wilkerson's book, for example, as a very good example of a conversation that is spanning the local and the global in that sense. So I do, of course, agree that, and I really don't think that the project of decoloniality, while it stresses multiple futures and futures that we cannot even imagine at this time, that whole process, I don't think decoloniality imagines that these are closed spaces where we engage with only the kinds of power relations in which we are enmeshed. Decoloniality assumes, I mean, after all, who are the thinkers that Mignolo calls decolonial? Fanon. Fanon speaks directly to us in the rest of the global South. So I think there's a way in which the idea of the global South presumes conversations, it presumes translations, translation of one experience into another. And the exciting thing about translations is that translations, and any of us who has, every conversation is a translation, of course. But even if you look at translation in the literal sense of translating from one language to another, not from one conceptual universe to the other, but just from one language to the other, we are aware that translation always involves an act of creation. It involves misrecognition. It involves miscommunication. So there's a kind of what Naoki Sakai calls heterolinguality involved, right? There's always the possibility of not understanding one another. And that might be the most productive spot. So I think we should use the idea of the global South as a partner of the term decoloniality. It's a project that goes together, and I think it opens up conversations in radically new ways. And it certainly does. It certainly does not enable building of walls at all.
Yeah, and an important thing to remember in the time when many of us are living in various contexts where those walls seem to be going up and up and up. I mean, I'm literally stuck in Australia where I'm told that I can't leave without permission. So, and going back to a country that has just opted out of the European Union. So yes, we know this story well. And so, okay, so the other question, which sort of picks up on something we talked about just a little bit earlier, about, you know, who produces knowledge in this process. So the other thing that I had said to you that I really admire in your work is the way in which you produce work that's theoretically very rich, but also that you have always tried to write to a wider audience as well. So I mean, I think that comes through in your books, but also that's what I particularly love about the blog Kafila, that I think, you know, the sort of space that provides to have very difficult, you know, sort of very complex, difficult conversations, but in a way that hopefully is engaging a broader audience is really important. And so I wondered if you could say something more about what you see the role of the academic, the intellectual, the theorist to be in the decolonial project.
I think we, first of all, have to acknowledge what enables this kind of multiple modes of address, which many of us try to adopt. There's an academic mode of address, there's a mode of address to a non-academic public, and then there's a mode of address to a general public in a newspaper or something like this. And in these modes of address, we are less directly political and more directly political, in the sense that obviously in a newspaper article, you're making an argument. What I began by saying was that we need to acknowledge the role of the public university and public education in enabling this. And this is rapidly being eroded. What do I mean by this? That publicly funded universities, which are running on public funds with permanent jobs and tenures, are absolutely crucial for critical thinking to emerge. Because if you're going to keep teachers, faculty members under the threat, under the Damocles sword of a contract, which has to be renewed periodically. And I say all this because we see that it's here now in India. The new education policy intends to dismantle the public university completely, introduce the contract system, because they can see what the public university has done in India. The current regime can see that the public university system, the fact that university education is actually relatively quite cheap. School education is expensive, but if you can get through school, then university education is cheap. Very strong affirmative action policies has actually, over the past 2 decades, transformed the public domain. It has brought all kinds of exciting ideas into syllabi, because the presence of these movements and these students and these new conversations transform syllabi. So this kind of critical public is enabled by the public university, and we have to fight. And I'm speaking to some of you who are located in Britain. Britain began the process of dismantling the public university first, I think, before it happened in other parts of the world. It was a project that was carried out, and you all know to what extent it ties you down, and the kind of anxiety that younger scholars have. So I want to place that on the table in order to say that ideas are not produced in a vacuum. And intellectual thought and intellection are enabled when we build a society in which education is seen as a right. Free public education is a right, just as free healthcare is a right. So we need to, when I use the word right, I use it loosely now, but in the sense of it's something that we ought to be able to demand from our governments. So given that, I have been fortunate, my generation has been fortunate in having been part of a system which gave us the freedom to think critically, and to work at different levels. So we, I think, are well aware, my generation of academics in India are well aware that when we are writing a book in our discipline, it's a different mode, and we do follow the protocols of social sciences. We follow those protocols, even as we challenge them, even as we challenge disciplinarities and all of that. But the fact is that we follow a certain protocol, and then we are able to move to another register where, and these are not writings that are going to be put into our CVs, right? They're not going to go into our list of publications. These are things we're doing in order to make ourselves just feel relevant, in order to just feel relevant. So yes, there are different registers of writing, and Kafila is actually, it's now 13 years old. It's completely unfunded. It's run entirely by some of us who basically just make time for it apart from our day jobs. And that has its advantages and its disadvantages. But when we started it, there was literally almost no independent a space that was independent of any kind of like business funding or anything, and very little online presence of these kinds of views. Of course, in the last 12 or 13 years, that has changed. So in fact, we find excellent online portals which are actually offering a challenge to the corporate media, via Scroll, to name just two. But Kafila remains unfunded, and we enjoy writing. It's our space. And now, of course, there's so many other spaces for debates. So the kind of debates we used to have on Kafila over every post now happen elsewhere, right? On Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and so on. So it's in a quieter phase now. It's almost like a good solid middle-aged person who is now just settling into doing what she can. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, talking about the fight for public universities, as my Goldsmiths colleagues will all vouch, we are coming out from the end of a very extended period of industrial action, where and a lot of the fight has been exactly around the ridiculous precarity within which so many of our colleagues are being expected to work, contract, and what that does. I mean, not just for their well-being, but also for the well-being of the institution and for thinking, as you say. So yes, so I hear you. So yeah, I suppose you also actually mentioned a couple of other things that kind of link to the next question that I'm going to ask you, which is, so your book, Recovering Subversion, is one of my favorites and has certainly been one of the most important in terms of informing my own work. And I obviously, well, not obviously, but coming from a legal background and working predominantly in the field of human rights, I found your analysis of the limits of feminist engagements with institutional liberal frameworks obviously really insightful. And also I've found your critical engagements with Partha Chatterjee and the idea of his conception of political society as opposed to civil society very productive. And so I wondered if you could reflect, so maybe first of all, say a little bit about, what those terms mean, but also I was wondering how you think about these sort of tensions between civil and political society and also the limits of liberal discourses around, say, rights currently playing out in India. You can say elsewhere, but maybe to start off by saying about India.
So let's talk about the key argument of recovering subversion then, which is, I think, applicable. It's a more of a theoretical argument about how the law works, right? And my argument about the law there was that it is impossible for the law to capture the complicated ways in which, and the very complex ways in which feminism thinks about justice, the ethical vision of feminism. So I was talking about feminism there, but I think this would be true for many kinds of socially transformative movements which think about transformations of society. So let me, take the example of sexual harassment, and what I had said there, and I'd also said it in Seeing Like a Feminist, is that many of us found the Vishakha guidelines, which were issued by the Supreme Court, extremely hospitable to creating institutional norms that guided how we would deal with sexual harassment. So in fact, most universities use the Vishakha guidelines to set up sexual harassment committees. All these were actually produced out of massive democratic conversations with different groups of people, students, teachers, etc. Every university that took it seriously developed its own code. None of them thought about it simply as dealing with sexual harassment, but also about awareness building, changing modes of thinking, because especially in India, the universities are spaces where cultures collide, where class worlds collide, and we're building new worlds. And these sexual harassment committees thought in terms of building new worlds. So when I said that law is the problem, the argument was never that we don't need any kinds of rules and regulations. So I, in fact, made a distinction between rules that are developed by smaller communities. So you can see the link to decoloniality here again. You see, so although it's not a word, as I said, that I've ever used, when I encountered the word, I could see the ways in which one relates to it. So the rules that are evolved by a smaller community, even if it's not exactly face-to-face, but a university is a very small community. So building up of rules which take into account the uniqueness of that space, teaching, learning, these are very different from a factory floor. Sexual harassment on a factory floor should have a different kind of policy. So what the Vishakha guidelines enabled was different kinds of policies which could suit different spaces. There was a push for a law against sexual harassment. Many political parties also, with all good intentions, demanded one. There was the there was the rape and death of Jyoti Singh, whom I honor by taking her name. And after that, there was a law against sexual harassment, which completely undid, and it overturned all the sexual harassment committees. It set up completely institutionally focused internal complaints committees, which are run by the employer. The employer, it's completely nominated. The committees are nominated. There are no elections. So it simply reflects the power structure. Most ICCs, and there have been now some studies, most ICCs disbelieve the complainant and treat the now. Why is that happening? Because it's one law suits all. It's one law with one framework, and so law falls in the civil society domain if we look at the two terms. And I find Partha Chatterjee's distinction extremely productive between civil society, which operates in this way through laws and rights and so on. I think most of you are familiar with the distinction that he makes, and political society is the space. Now, I pick up the term and move in a somewhat different direction, and that's why it's so productive, because Partha Chatterjee sees, or his understanding of political society is very much within the model of development and the developmentalist state, which engages with the population and which negotiates and so on. Whereas I actually think we need to see see political society as the space of maybe not the irrational, maybe the space of communities that don't want to engage with the state, that want to actually secede. All kinds of things happen in political society. So political society is a term that helps us to, I think, recognize that mass politics is not actually decipherable at all times in the language of. So that's the I think the value of this distinction. I think your question was, there was one more element to your question. Have I addressed? Because your questions are so amazing, Kiran. Yes, they're really amazing. You've really spent a very thoughtful questions. Thank you.
No, I was actually just, I mean, this is exactly what I was thinking, that the ways in which I've read you speaking back to Chatterjee on this political society question, actually I've found really productive, and I think that I'm ultimately closer to your reading than his. And the question, the sort of final part of the question was more just how do you see currently in the context of India, thinking about the sort of the limits of these particular civil society frames, thinking about political society, thinking about obviously the quite difficult political situation that you are living in. How are you kind of reflecting on these questions now, I guess?
I'm not sure that I'm thinking of it in terms of civil society, political society. I could, but I think I would need to reflect a little bit more. But what one does see, I think, in today's India, what has been, I think, fairly well established to my satisfaction by now, is that the earlier ways in which I'm moving away from the first part of your question. So this is now a question which I'm going to talk about how I see what's happening in India today with the Hindu Rashtra project, which is being laid out before us. So it's a twin project, which I think we were not fully expecting, that Hindu Rashtra would be so closely twinned with corporate capitalism. This very close twinning, we were, I think by we, I mean those who have been studying Indian politics, etc. I think there was a sense in which we didn't see how closely they would twin. So what we're looking at is a project which involves both of these. And as far as, and of course, the corporate capitalist project many other parties may be able to pick up. But so in addition, there's the Hindu Rashtra project. And I think what has become very evident is I find it not very useful any longer to analyze election results in terms of what is the kind of what is the kind of caste arithmetic that the BJP did, and the kind of political analysis that we do, I think we have to understand that that elections are not, and I'm going to say this is recorded and I've said it, I've written it, and I stand by it. Elections in India are no longer fair. They're not fair. The election commission plays a very partisan role. The EVMs are extremely doubtful. Not a single case against EVMs have been heard in courts. All the cases are buried. All the petitions are buried. So what we're seeing is a coup d'etat by the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. Particularly after May 2019, it was a coup d'etat. That election, at most, BJP would have been the single largest party. That kind of sweep. So then to analyze what is it that draws people to the Hindu Rashtra project is to actually ask the wrong question. Because I think what we see, particularly in the last couple of years, particularly since the CAA, is that project does not hold. It does not hold for large sections of India. Even the CAA, which only affects Muslims, really. It literally is a law that affects only Muslims. And yet, every section of India was up in arms about it. It was not only Muslims who were speaking up against the CAA. So I think the Hindutva project is able to sustain itself because of using the powers of the state to subvert institutions. I think that's what we see today. And so in that sense, if one were to think about civil and political society, I don't see civil society at all, in fact. I think all of this is political society now, including the resistance to Hindu Rashtra, is being conducted. Of course, the CAA was conducted in an impeccably political society language, right? The reassertion of the constitution and so on. But if you look at the farmers' movements, so there's a way in which laws are being used, every single law passed after May 2019, including the laws on Kashmir, which has turned Kashmir into a large open-air prison, essentially. All these are laws that are passed legitimately in a parliament. So clearly there's a way in which only political society can resist it now. So I think that's what we're seeing.
Okay, I have so many more questions for you, but I think that there will also be many, many questions from other people. So I might stop here, but I know that and it sort of continues a little bit, I think, the conversation about the sort of limits of law, but also takes us beyond that. I think Hasana wanted to ask a question about intersectionality. So I will hand over to her. And then after that, we'll stop the recording and then open it up for general discussion.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, Nivedita. It's very enlightening and very interesting to hear sadly about the Indian politics, also the global politics, very much connected to Sri Lankan experience as well, I would say. So my question is, actually, I'm not sure whether my question will be clear also, but just wanted to ask this. So the article on Is Feminism About Women? A Critical View on Intersectionality from India. So I've been trying to read that. So as far as my little understanding of intersectionality and the concept, so it comes from initiated at the Kumbahi River Collective and then theorized by Crenshaw, and it has been used. So in our discussions or in our life, intersectionality is very core to feminism, and that's how we also engage in our discussions or in our activism and everything. So when it comes to this article, I also understand the first part, how that intersectionality, that concept is used to get funding, or how that I also agree with that point. And the second part of the question, well, I really wish that you could explain a little bit more about that. For example, we understand the experiences are different in country. For example, caste is like, in the global south, and decolonialism or the colonizers, how they further reinforced or took advantage of that issues. But could you please explain the argument that you are raising here? So intersectionality, do we reject that, or how do we rethink, or is it not applying in the global south?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the argument I'm making in that essay has to do with the conceptual term intersectionality, which has a particular history and a particular weight and a particular meaning in a very specific context, because when Kimberly Crenshaw uses it, it's in the context of the law, it's in the context of race and gender in the space of the law, and it's a term that which has and it's very powerful and very useful in that particular context. What I am arguing in that essay is that when I see the term intersectionality as a term, so I'm not saying that intersection doesn't make sense, intersecting doesn't make sense. These are words in English that continue to make sense. But if you're going to use intersectionality, so I used the term conceptual universe earlier. So intersectionality comes out of a very specific conceptual universe. And it seems to me that there are multiple ways in which whether in India or in other parts of the global south, feminism, or what used to be called the women's movement, which we now no longer, or we very rarely say the women's movement, right? We say the feminist movement because of the multiple genders that are involved, who are involved in any movement of feminist politics. So that shift, right? So there are ways in which feminist politics has been challenged. And the idea of the woman as the subject of feminist politics has been challenged through caste, through race, through sexuality, through gender identities. It's been continuously challenged. And in India, we are talking about, and in all our spaces, you would all be able to say the same thing. We are talking about work and politics from the 18th century onwards, maybe even earlier, right? I mean, it depends on how you read and how you read certain kinds of assertions. Do you want to see bhakti poetry, for example, or the bhakti saints? Do you want to see them as challenging patriarchy as well? Then it goes back a very long way. Or you have Jyotiba Phule and so on. So there are multiple ways in which Savitribai Phule, there are multiple ways in which caste has been continuously disrupting any attempt to set up woman, the subject of woman as feminist politics. So I find it's part of, in fact, the other project that decoloniality challenges. It seems like part of that to me, where one category that emerged in the West in a very specific context, in a particular part of the world, can simply be brought to bear upon all these multiple experiences. And then once again, the global south becomes the space of data and facts, which have to match this concept. So in other words, intersectionality emerges in the 20th century in the US, but we will use it to talk about 19th century politics and 18th century politics, and we will just apply that term. So this is really something that is part of, for me, the project of decolonizing theory, which is not to treat the global south as a space which can accommodate every theoretical formulation that has emerged from the West. And basically, we keep measuring ourselves vis-a-vis that. Rather, let's look at the ways in which, politics has actually, and intellection and thinking has actually worked in these parts of the world. So I think, so sometimes I'm asked, so what is the term that you would like to use instead of intersectionality? And I don't think there has to be one term that captures all these experiences. So that's one part of my argument. So I there has been some misunderstanding of my argument there, including by my friends and colleagues who, and this is part, I think, of feminist politics, that we agree and disagree and we argue. So I find that that's part of what feminism is. But I think there's a way in which my critique of the conceptual category has been understood or thought of as if I was saying that Indian feminist politics has always taken on board caste. That is not, in fact, if you read my article, that's not what I'm saying. In fact, I'm saying it's been consistently pushed and challenged and made to take on board more and more ways in which the idea of woman is fractured. In fact, I've also argued in another essay that the more the identity of woman is fractured, the more powerful the feminist politics. In fact, the kind of politics that tries to consolidate the identity of woman is the problematic politics. That's a kind of state-led feminism, developmentalism, that kind of a thing. So that's broadly what I'm saying about the term intersectionality. But there's another part to it, to my discomfort with the term, which is that intersectionality could be understood to be could be understood to be suggesting the fluidity of subject positions. But in fact, it doesn't. And Kimberly Crenshaw herself, at some point, she uses that, and I've talked about it, she uses that metaphor of the highway, right? And there's the road marked race. So ultimately, there is a way in which the term intersectionality is used to congeal certain identities and not other identities. So rather than seeing the intersection as empty, which could be crossed by multiple identities, it becomes a filled space in which so it becomes closer to standpoint theory, I feel. Certain kinds of intersectionality, so some of you, you know what standpoint theory is. I'm sure you've encountered it, which is the kind of argument that that the reality of human experience is revealed from the standpoint of the most oppressed. So it could be, a certain kind of argument would be that it's the working class, another kind of argument would be it's a working class woman, and so on. You can layer it, but there's one standpoint. So which obviously is not something that I find very productive, precisely because of the fluidity of identities. I think sometimes the way in which intersectionality is used, it seems closer to standpoint theory for me, which I find not very. So there are two reasons. And there is actually a fair amount of critique of intersectionality from even feminists of color in the West. So that's broadly what I would say about.
Yeah, and this is why I also wanted to ask you about the intersectionality question, even before actually I had read that particular essay, because this is one of the things I've been struggling with in my own work, that I feel like actually where I'm positioned is thinking about how anti-racist politics and feminist politics get pitted against each other. I've worked in the Australian context, in France, in the UK, and actually the kind of limits of intersectionality in helping us reconcile those positions. So that's kind of, and that's where I find Jaspia Boer's critique of intersectionality also very helpful, and to sort of think more about the processes by which identities are formed and what is made visible and what is invisible and what gets kind of fixed and what isn't. I think that sort of focus on the process rather than the identities seems to me a kind of productive way to go. But it's great to have your reflections on this as well. I think
Can I take a moment, Kiran? Can I take a moment to? It
Yes.
Suddenly struck me that there's a brilliant small short film in Hindi, which is subtitled. So everyone, it's subtitled in English, so everyone can watch it. I will put it into the comments, or I'll send Kiran the name later. It's called Gili Puchi, which means a wet kiss. And it's by a brilliant filmmaker called Neeraj Ghaiwan. And it's about an hour. It's part of an anthology of films. And so you have to basically have to skip the first two. It's available on Netflix. It's a film about caste and sexuality and gender and class and patriarchy. And it's such a remarkable illustration of the fluidity of the ways in which privilege operates and the ways in which disprivilege operates. It's a love story between two women, a Dalit woman and a Brahmin woman. It's absolutely brilliant, and it illustrates. So if in this course, at some point, if you can show it, perhaps I think you would have a very interesting discussion.
Oh, thank you. Yes, definitely. We'll take that reference, and we have a session on caste coming up where we can definitely bring that in. Okay, so I'm conscious